Afternoon to everybody. So I can't quite forgive the college for the find that they had before I arrived here, which was absolutely unacceptable. It should have come at the same time, and then I would have really felt that I was coming home. But what I have to do is I have to apologize to you. So I am not a historian. So anything that I say in here that is wrong is entirely my fault. I'm an amateur. This is not what I do for a living. What I am is I'm a human anatomist. So my job is to understand every aspect of the human body, and I apply it in the courts, in the medical legal context, as a forensic expert. So my job, for example, was in identification of those during the war crimes in Kosovo, in the mass fatality events, for example, in the Asian tsunami, during the Iraq war. Those are the sorts of things that I normally do. So a lot less clean than the things that I hope I'm going to show you this afternoon. Very kindly, we were told that something was going to happen down where that blue arrow is. Now, where you're sitting round about number 4. And it's really important to know that where we want to go with that blue arrow is north. We're heading out of Oxford and we're heading north. And historically, that's going to become important. What happened was we were building a new quad. We were building Kendrew Quadrangle, named after one of our presidents, who was a Nobel Prize winner. And it's a beautiful quad built around a tree. We can't knock the tree down, so the quad was built around the tree. And in 2008, as we'd had the permission and we were digging down into the foundations, and here we are at the time digging down to there, you can see that's the Tommy White buildings on either side there. And then in the next one, what you'll see is out onto Blackhall Road with Keble College behind, that we uncovered a mass grave. That mass grave was on our site. It's on the site of the Kendrew Quad, and it's on that wall adjacent to Blackhall Road. We hadn't expected it. Nobody had expected there to be a mass grave when you were digging. But at the end of the day, do you know, I've never been surprised when you put a shovel in the ground anywhere in the UK, the chances of finding people there are pretty high. What's really important about them, just looking at it from this perspective, there is no care taken with the disposal of those bodies. So that when you look at a mass grave where there is care taken, the bodies are laid, and they're usually laid in the same orientation. They're usually not touching. Hands, for example, may be crossed or they may be down at the side. We've got one individual here. We've got another individual there. We've got another cross cut under there. Another one here, another one there. And look at the arms of that individual. That individual has been picked and thrown in. So this is a mass grave without due care and attention. Somebody, whoever has been responsible for this burial, has had no investment in dealing with these bodies in a way that is proper, rightful, and dignified. It is just simply a disposal. So we knew a bit about them. There were about 37 bodies, and I say about 37 because I think at different points throughout time some of them had been disturbed. But there were at least 37 individuals in that. Who were they? How long had they been there? Was there anything we could tell about them? One of the most, and I've done very many stupid things in my life, but one of the things I agreed to do was the 2022 Royal Institution Christmas lectures. It was a really bad idea because it was the first Christmas when I started this job. And so trying to do the lectures at the same time as being straight into the college was really a bad idea. But they wanted me to look at identification and forensic science and to talk about the crime scene and to talk about the courtroom. And I thought for the very first episode that we did, wouldn't it be great if we could take a skeleton that had some meaning to us and rebuild the life of that individual? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take one of those skeletons from the mass grave in Kendrew Quad. We're going to rebuild their life, and we're going to see through modern forensic techniques what could we tell about that individual when that individual was alive. So I took Denise, who some of you may have met wandering around, Denise Cripps, and Jenny Diamond, who work with me in the President's office, and we went off up to Whitney to have a look into the archives of where the Archaeological Trust holds skeletal material. So it was a little bit of an eye-opener for them because they'd never quite seen me in that professional mode. And as I went through the skeletons, the 37 plus skeletons, I chose this one, SK2057. And the reason I chose 2057 was not because there was anything I knew about the individual, it's because it was relatively intact. And the principle is the more of a body that is present, the greater the chance you have of being able to extract information about who that individual may have been. So laid out here, you can see the feet at the bottom, the legs, the pelvis, the vertebral column. You can see the ribs are quite badly fragmented. You can see a jaw at the front of the table there, and you can see that we've got the top part of the skull. We do have the facial bits, but they're all in fragments. And I have the most wonderful colleagues who are able to scan every fragment and in the computer reconstruct the whole skull. So we don't have to glue it together anymore, which is what we used to do, you know, sticking our plastic gloves to the glue. Now we can all do it on the computer. So the first thing they did was came in and they scanned from Liverpool John Moores University every single fragment of bone. And then they would be able to rebuild the skull for me. And if we could rebuild the skull, there was a hope that we might be able to reveal what a potential face looked like. And that's the thing that is the most identifiable to all of us. That's the icing on the cake, and that's where we wanted to get to. But what do we do first of all? What we do first of all is we want to have a really broad brush approach that says, when I look at the skeleton, what does it tell me? And it's really a caricature of the individual. It's an outline in some ways. It wasn't Donald Trump, I hasten to add, but you see what I mean by that concept. Is that we get an outline of the person. We know what sex they were. We know what age they were when they died. We can calculate their height and we'll hopefully know something about their ancestral origin. And from a police investigation, that's the thing that says we're looking for a male, somewhere between 25 and 30, 5'6" to 5'8" in height and white. And it doesn't tell you who that person is, but it does allow you to exclude certain categories. And that's what we're about in this broad brush approach. Then what we want to do is we want to add the flesh to it. And we want to be able to say, once we've done that, what can we tell? Can we tell anything about diseases they may have, habits they may have had, trauma that they might have had through life that may be a result of the manner of their death or the cause of their death? And could we ever get to a name? Because fundamentally in a forensic world, if you cannot get back to the name of the individual, then the chances of tracking down what has happened to them is extremely slim. So that because we may have a body found on the hillside, if we can't come back to say it's John Smith, I can't go and investigate John Smith's family or John Smith's relatives and try to figure out what it was that happened to them. So the prospect, if this is archaeological, of getting back to a name is, of course, extremely unlikely. And so we have to be realistic about it. But forensically, that's where we're trying to get to. And here's the big reveal. It isn't Donald Trump who was in the mass grave in Kendrew. So the first thing we're going to want to do in those is we're going to want to determine the sex of the individual. And sex and gender, as you know, are very different things. And when we're looking at the sex determination within a skull, what we're going to do is, these are two casts, so these aren't real skulls. And I'm going to show you how we would go about determining whether the individual we're looking at is male or female, because that's the most important of the characteristics of identification. If you can separate that out, 50% of the population have been removed as a possibility of identification. So the skull is really useful for determining the sex of an individual. If you look at the skull, there are a number of areas, this is female and this is male, that we're going to target that will give us a clue as to what's going on. So I give you permission now to go home tonight and feel somebody's head, don't do it now, to be able to see if you can find these characteristics. If it's a male skull, then what you get is you get this area of really deep indentation, muscles, the male head is bigger than the female head. Of course, the female head has got a bigger brain inside it, but no, I wouldn't say that. So that what we have here is, because the male head is bigger, it has greater weight, so the muscles have actually got to really pull it back up. And we get a much smoother base on a female, and we get a much rougher base for the attachment of those muscles in the male. What we also get, have a look at the men sitting around the room in front of you, just above your eyebrows, in this area here. In women, go on, have a feel. Just above your eyebrows, it's pretty flat in women. You've got a cracking set, okay? So these protuberances, it's great, yeah? Yeah. So that men have that. It's to do with the muscles associated with the jaw. Because you have more muscles, the muscles are stronger, and the tensions are dissipated up onto these brow ridges. So you get brow ridges in the male, which you don't tend to get in the female. The other thing that you have is right at the back of your ear there's a big lump. So this thing here that's called the mastoid process, it sits behind the opening into your ear. And attaching onto there is this muscle, which is called sternocleidomastoid. And because, again, it's about holding your head up, the mastoid processes in the males are much bigger than the mastoid processes in the female. And then right at the back of your head, if you have somebody who's with you, please don't do it to a stranger, but particularly only in gentlemen, don't do it to ladies, is right at the back of your skull, if you're male, you'll find a really big sticky out knobbly bit. It's called an external occipital protuberance. I bet you've got one. I've got to do it. Have I got permission?
Of course.
Have I got permission? There it is. Right there. An external occipital protuberance. It's again for muscle attachment. And we find it in the male and we don't find it in the female. So when we're looking at our skull, which is the SK skull, we've got a large mastoid process, we've got a large orbital protuberance, and a really big external occipital protuberance. That tells us everything about the skull is saying it's masculine. It's not a feminine skull. Doesn't mean it's male, but it's a masculine skull. But we don't always know that the skull belongs to the rest of the body. Just because it's found with it, that could be coincidence. And the only point at which the skull articulates with our vertebral column are two tiny little joints at the top. So we can't always be certain that a skull belongs to a column. So we have to look to other parts of the body for other indicators of sex determination. And we go to the pelvis. So that what we have is we have a male pelvis and we have a female pelvis. How do we tell the difference? One of the biggest changes that happens post-puberty is that the pelvis in the female has got to completely change shape. Because trust me, if you're going to get a baby's head in, you sure as heck want to be able to get that baby's head back out. And I can show you that with an orange. So that in the female pelvis, there's enough room, and that is a big orange, it's about the size of a baby's head. There's enough room for that to get through the pelvic cavity. If you try to put that orange onto a male pelvis, it doesn't go, because it doesn't have that secondary sexual changes. So we can look at the pelvis of our individual, and that matches as being very masculine as well. So the pelvis is masculine, the skull is masculine. So everything about it is saying this is a male skull. Nothing about it is saying it's female at all. That was the first characteristic, if you remember. The second characteristic was how old was the individual. And in many ways, there are three phases of our life. There is the first phase of our life where we are growing. You can go to a shop and you can buy a pair of trousers for a 6-year-old. You can't buy them for a 42-year-old because that growth is directly related to age. So we're very good at determining the age of children, babies in particular, to within weeks, children to within months, or to within just a couple of years. But once you get into an adult phase, once you get to sort of post-25, up until about 40-ish, but maybe a little bit lower, then we have a period of stasis. There's nothing really interesting happens in the human body around age at that time. Once you get post late 30s, I'm so sorry, everything is downhill after that. and we're going to degenerate. And some of us will degenerate quicker than others, and we'll start to find indicators of arthritis and osteoporosis and the kind of diseases that we would expect. Bones will fracture. So if we were looking at the teeth, for example, of our individual, and this is just a cast, we might look at how the teeth are forming. So these are baby teeth, and these are the permanent teeth growing underneath. And of course, as they grow upwards, they push these out and they come into their own position. And this is a permanent first molar, because we can see the roots, but they haven't quite finished forming yet. So we're very good if the individual is younger at being able to determine their age. We're not so good when an individual is older. And we tend to say they're 40 plus, or we might say that they're somebody who's in quite an advanced, mature age. And I'm not going to give you what we would mean by that, because I might offend everybody. And this is what the teeth look like on our individual. He's lost the teeth at the front. These are premolars. There's the first molar, second molar, third molar. All the adult teeth are through. So we've got no baby teeth. We're not talking about a very young individual. But what is really interesting, that first molar, can you see it's very worn? It's quite flat. And the diet at that time is quite high in grit, so that teeth are going to be worn down. The second molar has got less wear on it, because the second molar comes into the mouth later than the first molar. First molar comes in when you're about 6. Second molar comes in when you're about 12. Third molar comes in, there it is there. It's called a wisdom tooth, because it's supposedly when you gain your wisdom. And they, if they're coming in, will come in by around about 18 years of age. But they don't always come in. Look at the wear on them. A lot of wear on 6, next to no wear on 7, and no wear at all on 8. You can see these ridges. That says that it might have come into occlusion with the tooth above it, but it hasn't worn away. And those wisdom teeth are going to come in by about 17 or 18 years of age normally, if there's enough room for them. But because there's no wear on it, this is not an old individual. This is somebody who's a younger individual. All their adult teeth are through, but there's been very, very little wear on that third molar. I want to then take you down to the area of the sacrum, which is at the base of the spine. So there's the spine, and it sits between the two hip bones. And what I'm doing is, it looks as if it's broken there, and I'm pulling it away. It isn't. That bit of the sacrum hasn't fused yet. And it will fuse as you get older, because it needs to form a really solid bone right at the base of your skull, of your spine. And that's going to fuse by the time you're 25. So we know this individual is an adult, but we suspect they're going to be younger than 25 years of age. And I've got no arthritis in there. I've got no osteoporosis. I've got no age-related disease. And it fits with what we're seeing on the teeth. This is my favourite bone. Of any bone that you could choose, this is the one. This is the clavicle, the collarbone that sits on the edge here. And what we're looking at are these joints just in the midline. And that's what this surface is here. And you can see that it looks very pitted, apart from this flat bit that looks like somebody stuck it on. That's called an epiphyseal plate. It's a growth plate. And that growth plate is still growing. That will have finished by the time the individual is 25. So the individual is younger than 25. And actually, to have it fused in one point, because it is stuck on there, but not to cover the whole surface, this is an individual who's younger than that. This is going to be somebody who's in their late teens or their early 20s. And that fits right the way across everything that we've seen in the skeleton. So now we've got a young man, late teenager, maybe early 20s, but I'm definitely heading towards him being a teenager. What can we tell about the rest of him then? Well, we can calculate his height, because we can measure his bones. We've done that. But the other thing we did was we took a sample from the left femur, left thigh bone here. That's not broken. That was us that took the sample. And we did some stable isotope analysis. And the stable isotope analysis looks at the ratio of isotopes such as carbon, oxygen, nitrogen. And the combination of those isotopes tells us something about where you were when you were eating that food. We think our diet's terribly cosmopolitan. It isn't. And I can tell you that because when we looked at the hair on the London bombers, we could determine along the length of that hair if there was any change in the signature of the stable isotopes to say this individual had been in the Afghan training camps, and they hadn't. We knew that that cell had come from the north of England. So if you're from Oxford, I could probably tell from looking at your hair and your nails anyway, less so your bones because they turn over, that you came from the Oxford area. Another thing that I will share with you, which absolutely and utterly blows my mind every single time, is there's a little bit of bone inside your skull, right surrounding your inner ear, which is the bit that does your hearing and your balance. And that little bit of bone is formed when you are a fetus inside your mum, and it never remodels. So that if we analyse the bone from this otic capsule, I can tell you where your mother was living when she was pregnant with you. So that the information that's held within the human skeleton is really quite incredible. It's that thing, if your mother's always inside your head, isn't she? Never get her out. So when we look at the stable isotopes of this individual, it not only tells us where in the world you may have come from, it tells you what you've been eating. So we can tell if the individual is a carnivore or a herbivore. We can tell whether they have a high level of marine diet. And this individual does have a very high level of marine diet. Now, not a lot of fish at that time I would have expected around Oxford. So it does make us think, is this somebody who's come from somewhere else? And when we look particularly at the isotope ratios of the oxygen, which will tell us a lot about the water, that is telling us it's Northern Europe, up and towards Scandinavia, but much more likely to be around Denmark. And that is a clue that becomes incredibly important. So when we've gone through our broad brush approach and we've started to look at some of the things associated with disease and habit, we're going to get to trauma and cause of death in a moment. But for our individual, we believe he's male. We believe he's somewhere between 17 and 20. I like 18, I have to say, but that may be so. He's somewhere between 5'10" and 5'11" in height. So it's a good height, given somebody that we believe died over 1,000 years ago. A marine diet and possibly a Danish origin. You can see where we're going with this now, and it fits exactly what we're expecting. So what about a cause of death and a manner of death? They're a different thing. The manner of death may be that somebody hit you with something. The cause of death may be hemorrhaging. So the manner of death and the cause of death are two very different things. There are three ways that we can look at trauma. We can look at ballistic trauma, so something that is from a gun or from some kind of a projectile. We can look at sharp force trauma, which is if somebody uses a bladed implement or something at least that has a sharp edge, and something that is blunt force trauma. So either blunt force trauma because something hits you, or your head, you fall and it hits something else. We looked at ballistics, but if our dating is right of 1,000 years ago, there weren't too many guns around at that time, but we did want to have a look at the ballistic possibility. So we got ourselves an ostrich egg and we dyed it green because we wanted to get the contrast of colours, and then we fired a gun at it. And that's what an entry wound looks like. So if we had found any entry wound from ballistics on the skull or anywhere else, it's a tight little hole. And that's when you see them saying it's, whatever kind of millimetre gun, is because you can literally measure it. And there is very little disruption to the front entry wound site. Where disruption occurs is where the bullet exits. And this is the exit site. So what you can see as it passes through the brain, what it does is it explodes out the other end. So the exit wound from a ballistic projectile is always bigger than the entry wound. And what we're able to do is to place a rod through it, and you can see then what the projectile direction of the bullet is. We didn't find anything like this, as you would expect in our individual. When you look at blunt force trauma, another egg, so what we did is we hit it with a spoon. Of course we did, it's an egg, you have to hit it with a spoon. This is classic blunt force trauma. So the point of contact remains undisrupted, because the point of the spoon is in touch with it. It then bends the surface outwards. So what you get are these concentric fractures, and you get this sort of cobweb appearance. And that's a classic blunt force trauma. If somebody was to hit a head with a baseball bat or something along those lines, these are the kinds of trauma marks that we would expect. Can we find any blunt force trauma? If we also look at it, what we can do is with this one, we actually hit it twice. And we can determine the order in which things happen. So that the fracture that you can see that irradiates out from here stops here. That tells me that this fracture pattern, which was from the front, happened before this one. This is a secondary site of impact. This is a primary site of impact. So we look at where those fracture lines interact with each other so we can determine which came first and which came second. We want to be able to look at weapons. If our dating is right around 1,000 years ago, we want to be able to look at the kind of weapons that we may have to consider. So we may have axes, for example, heavy-bladed instruments. We might have finer-bladed instruments. So it might be knives, for example, which can either be cutting or they can be stabbing. And those marks will be left on the bone if, in fact, it came in contact with the bone. But not every stabbing will. If you were to stab between the ribs, you will go in and you will damage soft tissue, but you'll not harm the bone around it. And so we can't always determine whether there has been any form of trauma. And because we know the timing, we wanted to ask about what sort of arrows, for example, might have been used at the time. And this is a bodkin arrow. And what it does is it produces a sort of squared diamond shape impact. So we're looking for probably not ballistic trauma, but we are looking for sharp force trauma and we're looking for blunt force trauma. If I go to the back of his skull, what we can see is it looks as if we've got a bit missing. That isn't missing because this bone has a natural edge. This is healed trauma. And this is at the back of his head, and we think an axe has literally taken the back of his scalp off and the back of his skull off. But he survived. He survived because this has healed. And he's survived for a long time. So if I was to put my finger on the skin at the back of his head, there would be nothing separating my finger from his brain tissue other than a thin little bit of skin. So he's always going to be vulnerable at the back of his head. He'd been in a battle, he'd been in a fight, but he had survived it. But what I'm really interested in is what happens here. And the archaeologists who had looked at this beforehand said that this was a trepanation hole. And what trepanning was, is they would bore a hole into your skull if you complained of headaches and such things, because they wanted to get the evil spirits out. And so quite often you would find holes bored into skulls as a part of medical attention. But this didn't look like trepanation to me. And there's no healing around the edges. You can see that it's really quite ragged. So that looked to me like something entirely different. And you can see it there, that it looks very different to the rest. This would come together. But this is the defect caused by that sharp force trauma that he survived. But this sharp edge is something entirely different. It's exactly the shape of a bodkin arrow. So that poor chap not only had that horrid injury to the back of his head, he'd been shot at the back of the head with an arrow as well. But that didn't kill him. Because what that would have done, that would have pierced through the bone, but it's not going to have done any serious damage. It wouldn't have been very pleasant, that's for sure, but it wouldn't have killed him. When we look at his vertebral column, and we come down, there's a second vertebra, and we come down to the fifth one in his neck, what we find on the fifth vertebra, his fifth cervical vertebra, is another square defect. That's the arrow that killed him. So there was an arrow came into the left-hand side of his neck at the level of the fifth cervical vertebra, major blood vessels in there, and he would have bled out. So we have a cause of death, most likely, which would have been an arrow injury, and a manner of death, which was that he was felled, presumably in battle. So we know a lot about him, but how on earth does this fit into history? Well, it fits into history because in King Ethelred the Unready, which means not that he wasn't ready, it just means he was ill-advised, he put out an edict that all Danish men on England's soil must be put to death. And it was all to happen on a single day. And that day was the 13th of November in 1002. Never can we put an actual date on archaeological material as a date of death. but these skeletons came from the St. Brice's Day massacre. What happened was that Ethelred had given that edict out. They'd identified where all the Danish men were because the king was concerned that these Danish men were going to usurp his role as sovereign. They were going to take over. So the Danes, the Vikings, were going to take over sovereignty in English soil. So what we do know is we know that all the Danish men in Oxford were herded together. We know that what they were was they were headed out towards St. Frideswild Church, which is now Christ Church. And they ran into that church to get sanctuary, and they set the church on fire. And some of the bodies that we found, we could see the scorch marks still on the bone. Those that didn't die on the fire ran north out of Oxford, which is why I said that it's important that Kendrew Quad was north that way. They were heading out north of Oxford. They were being chased by the king's men, and the king's men were archers. And in this individual, I promise you it's just coincidence. This individual has an arrow in his neck round about the level of the 5th cervical vertebra. I promise you it really is a coincidence. But this is what the St. Brice's Day massacre looked like. So we hadn't expected to find that mass grave there, but in finding it, it fitted with the historical information that we had, and it allowed us to bring some of the forensic evidence to support that these individuals were a part of that St. Brice's Day massacre. What we then did, my very, very talented colleague, Caroline Wilkinson, was that she, as I say, scanned every bit of bone that she could. And those areas that are blue are the bits of bone that she didn't have. So what you do is you take the bone on the opposite side and you mirror image it so that you can create the whole skull. What she then does is that she places every single anatomical muscle in place. And it's a very anatomical process. It's a scientific process, but it requires a lot of artistic talent as well. When we're reconstructing a face for forensic purposes, we never expect it to look exactly like the person. All we're trying to do is make it close enough that somebody says, that looks like Joe Bloggs. That gives us a lead that we can go and follow. So with the archaeological material, we're never going to get as close as we'd like to because we will never know. But we'll still follow the same scientific principles. So Caroline placed all the muscles on, and what she also does is she places these little pegs on, these little round white pegs, and there's skin tissue thickness. So different groups of people at different ages have different thickness of skin. The younger you are, the thinner your skin is. The older you are, the thicker your skin is, till it becomes thin again. So that throughout our life, it varies. And if you're from different groups, then you'll have different thickness of skin. She will construct what she thinks the ears may look like, but we can never know what the ears look like because they're soft tissue. And we can never know what the eye colour and such things are, although some of the work that we're doing in genetics now, people are able to look at the whole DNA genome and be able to say the individual has brown eyes, blue eyes, will have blonde hair. But of course, that doesn't mean that you haven't gone out and bought a little bottle of hair colour. So at the end of the day, we can tell what hair colour you should be, not the one that you choose to present every day. We didn't do that with this because what we did was we kept very true in terms of the coloration to what we would expect for an individual that has Danish background at that time. And then a bit like putting icing over the top of a cake, what you then do is you spread the skin over the top and you create the face around it, dictated by the thickness of the skin through the pegs, the position of the muscles, and underneath that, the scaffold that was originally the skull. In a forensic case, we would never put colour on it because the minute you put colour on it, people assume an ethnic origin. And so we would never do that. We would never put hair colour on it or a hairstyle because people assume if the person there is missing doesn't look like that, then it can't be them. So we would always put out facial reconstructions in a forensic world as something that is very black and white or grey. We wouldn't put colour on it. But this is history. We can do what we like. And this is what he looked like. And when you look at him, a handsome chap, I have to say. When you look at him, this is the skull. This is a scar on the back of his scalp. and this is where the bodkin arrow went in at the back of his head. And so what Caroline then did was said, well, we need to make him look even more realistic. And this is what she thinks he may have looked like. It's totally inappropriate to give an archaeological specimen a name, so we did it. And we thought, given that he was found in St. John's, we would give him the Danish version, so he's Johannes. And we know that Johannes died on the 13th of November, 1002, in Oxford, and was buried in a mass grave in our Kendrew Quad. We know he was of Viking or Danish origin, and we suspect he was 19 or so years of age, felled by at least 2 bodkin arrows. It should stop there, but it doesn't. And I love the fact that fiction is so much more believable than fact. Because sometimes if we wrote what is fact into fiction, nobody would believe it. We decided that when we would look at Johannes, we would also have a look at him without his beard. Give him his hair, but give him his beard. And we had a 3D reconstruction made of his face. And he's going to be put back into Kendrew Quad. So we're going to return him to the site where we found him. For the last little while, he's actually been sitting on the windowsill of my office. And the porters have asked us to remove it because every time they go on their rounds at night, they look up and they think there's somebody in our office, and we've had to take him down. But the fact and fiction thing relates to one of our students. One of our students did one of these dreadful, don't do them if you're thinking about it, ancestry, DNA things. Please don't give your DNA to anybody. Please, if you've done it, I'm so sorry. But if you haven't, don't do it. And he did an ancestry DNA. And in those, what it does is it links back to known, particularly historical. And our student was genetically linked to this individual. Ridiculous. So Tom is directly genetically linked to the Dane who died in Kendrew. It proves Hotel California. You can check out of St. John's anytime you like, but you never leave. And your entire family and ancestors never leave either. And Tom's father, in many ways, is even more convincing. And we couldn't believe it when we did that reconstruction. And Tom totally came into us out of the blue and said, I'm related to one of those skeletons. And we said, which one? And he said that. And when you put those together, I found that incredible. We gave it to Caroline Wilkinson, who's our facial reconstruction expert, and said, do you think it's a good match? And she said, yes, actually, it really is. We wouldn't have had any problem if either of those photographs had come in, comparing it to our reconstruction to be able to say they could be the same individual. So that's what I mean by our fact being a whole lot stranger than our fiction. I never imagined for a moment that when I came to St. John's College that any part of my forensic or my anatomical work would ever come into the work of being the president. But I'm very happy to say that it has done. Thank you very much.